December 7, 1942. Detroit Arsenal Tank Plant, Warren, Michigan. The steam locomotive brought in to heat the factory floor during construction now sat silent, replaced by the roar of production that would make history. Inside the cavernous space where walls had barely finished rising months earlier, assembly line supervisor Walter Hayes checked his stopwatch for the 30th time that day, counting the interval between completed Sherman tanks rolling off the line. 28 minutes, 26, 24. The numbers kept dropping, and with each tank that emerged, Hayes knew something extraordinary was unfolding, something that would eventually reach the ears of German generals thousands of miles away and shatter their confidence in victory. What German military intelligence would soon learn, through reports filtering in from neutral Sweden, Spain, and Switzerland, was that this single factory, operated by Chrysler Corporation in a Detroit suburb, had achieved, in December 1942, what the entire German tank industry could not sustain for a year: 907 Sherman tanks. In 31 days, one every 49 minutes on average, with production accelerating toward the end of the month. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The mathematical implications were staggering. In 72 hours, 3 days, Detroit Arsenal alone could produce approximately 90 tanks. Germany's entire tank production across all factories averaged 75 tanks per month in late 1942. Detroit wasn't just outproducing Germany, it was rewriting the rules of industrial warfare in a way that would force even the most loyal Nazi generals to confront an uncomfortable truth. They had challenged an industrial power they never truly understood. The transformation had begun just 20 months earlier, in April 1941, when Chrysler broke ground on what would become the Detroit Arsenal. The company had never built a tank. When William Knudsen, President Roosevelt's production coordinator and former General Motors president, called Chrysler chief K.T. Keller in 1940 and asked if Chrysler could build tanks, Keller's response became legendary. "I don't know. I've never seen one of these things. What's a tank look like?" That honest admission of ignorance would become the foundation of America's tank production miracle. Chrysler didn't know how tanks were supposed to be built. They only knew how to mass-produce complex machines. They would apply automobile manufacturing principles to armor warfare and, in doing so, outpace an enemy who believed craftsmanship was superior to volume. The construction of Detroit Arsenal itself demonstrated American industrial philosophy. The plant covered 1.25 million square feet. Architect Albert Kahn designed it as a dual production facility, capable of manufacturing war materials but convertible to peacetime production afterward. This forward thinking, this assumption of eventual victory and return to civilian enterprise, represented a fundamental psychological difference from German war planning. The Germans prepared for total war, the Americans prepared for war followed by prosperity. By April 24, 1941, barely 5 months after breaking ground, the first M3 tank rolled off an assembly line surrounded by walls that weren't yet complete. The dedication ceremony, broadcast nationwide via radio, featured Michigan's governor and military officials. They watched the 30-ton steel monster fire its guns and demolish a mock wooden house. One tank, a proof of concept. German intelligence officers monitoring American media reported this event with skepticism. A publicity stunt, they concluded. Propaganda designed to mask American industrial weakness. German Major General Friedrich von Boetticher, military attaché in Washington until late 1941, had sent numerous reports to Berlin describing American production potential. His assessments were technically accurate but ideologically unacceptable. Von Boetticher noted that American automobile factories possessed production capacity exceeding all of Europe combined. He observed that Ford's Rouge plant in Dearborn employed 100,000 workers. He documented that General Motors, Chrysler, and Ford together produced over 4 million vehicles annually in peacetime. These facts reached Berlin. The interpretation, however, was filtered through Nazi racial ideology. Americans could build automobiles, yes, but automobiles were consumer goods, not weapons of war. The precision, discipline, and martial spirit required for military production demanded German character, German organization, German racial superiority. This ideological blindness would prove catastrophic. In July 1942, Detroit Arsenal switched from M3 production to the M4 Sherman tank. The Sherman represented everything German tank philosophy opposed. It wasn't the best tank on the battlefield. German Panthers and Tigers were superior in armor and firepower. The Sherman was designed for mass production, standardized components, simplified assembly, reliable rather than exceptional. The Germans built masterpieces. The Americans built multitudes. The Sherman's engine illustrated American industrial ingenuity born from necessity. Engineers took 5 6-cylinder engines originally designed for Chrysler, Royal and Windsor passenger cars and welded them together into a single 30-cylinder motor producing 425 horsepower. This Frankenstein creation, the A57 multibank, was neither elegant nor optimal. But it worked. It fit inside the tank, and Chrysler already possessed the tooling and manufacturing capacity to produce these engines at scale. The engine weighed nearly 2.5 tons, requiring bulges in both the tank's top and bottom to accommodate it. The Sherman, a 4 powered by this motor, was 11 inches longer than other variants and weighed 1.5 tons more. German engineers, examining captured specimens, scoffed at this crude solution. Then they counted how many of these crude tanks were destroying their forces. December 1942 marked the culmination of 18 months of relentless optimization. The assembly line operated in coordinated sections: hull welding, turret casting, suspension assembly, engine installation, gun mounting. Each section operated independently but synchronized perfectly. Workers, many of whom had never seen a factory interior before Pearl Harbor, performed specialized repetitive tasks. A woman who had been making breakfast for her children 6 months earlier now installed transmission components. A man who had operated a grocery store now welded armor plates. The specialization allowed rapid training. Workers didn't need to understand tank warfare. They needed to master their specific task and execute it repeatedly without error. The workforce composition would have violated every Nazi principle of proper society. Of Detroit Arsenal's 5,000 workers in December 1942, approximately 1,500 were women. 300 were African Americans. Dozens were disabled workers performing tasks suited to their capabilities. This diverse workforce, this mixture of races, genders, and abilities that Nazi ideology claimed would produce only chaos and inefficiency, was building tanks faster than the German master race could manufacture them with their supposed superior organization and racial purity. The irony was lost on German observers, or perhaps the irony was simply unacceptable. The production record set in December was 1942, 907 tanks, translated to just over 29 tanks per day, sustained throughout the month. German intelligence, receiving reports of this achievement from Swedish industrial observers, faced a choice: report the numbers accurately and risk accusations of defeatism, or modify the figures to make them more acceptable to Nazi leadership. Most chose the latter. Reports reaching the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the German High Command, described Detroit Arsenal's production as exaggerated by propaganda, and likely 1/4 to 1/3 of claimed figures. But mathematics doesn't negotiate with ideology. Even if German intelligence had been correct, even if the actual production was only 300 tanks monthly instead of 900, Detroit Arsenal alone would still equal approximately half of Germany's entire tank production across all factories combined, and Detroit Arsenal was just one facility. Chrysler operated it. Ford operated Willow Run building B-24 bombers. General Motors operated the Fisher body plant building tanks. Cadillac built M24 light tanks. The entire Detroit industrial complex, covering an area larger than many German cities, functioned as an interconnected arsenal that German planners simply couldn't conceptualize. The strategic implications were catastrophic for German war planning. By December 1942, Field Marshal Heinz Guderian, Inspector General of Panzer Troops, was struggling to replace tanks lost on the Eastern Front. German factories produced approximately 900 tanks total that month, across all models and all facilities. Detroit Arsenal alone matched that number, and the Sherman was heavier, more complex, and more capable than most German models in production at that time. When Guderian requested increased production from Armaments Minister Albert Speer, the response was always the same. We are producing at maximum capacity. We lack the raw materials, the machine tools, and the industrial infrastructure for further increases. In America, the response to production demands was different. When the military requested more tanks, Chrysler asked, "How many do you need, and when do you need them?" Then they reconfigured the assembly line, adjusted shift schedules, solved bottlenecks, and delivered. This fundamental difference in industrial mentality, this American confidence that any production target could be met through organizational innovation, represented a cultural advantage Germany couldn't overcome through military skill alone. The winter of 1942 to 1943 marked a turning point in German military intelligence's understanding of American production. Reports from multiple sources began painting a consistent picture that could no longer be dismissed as propaganda. Neutral Swedish executives visiting American factories, Spanish diplomats in Washington, Swiss bankers reviewing American industrial statistics, Portuguese merchants observing American shipping, Japanese naval attachés sharing intelligence from South America. All sources confirmed the impossible. American war production was accelerating beyond anything German planners had predicted possible. Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, chief of the Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence service, personally reviewed reports on American tank production in January 1943. His deputy, Major Friedrich Wilhelm Heinz, had compiled data from 17 independent sources. The numbers were consistent. America was producing tanks at rates 4 to 5 times greater than Germany. When Canaris presented these findings to Hermann Göring, the Reich Marshal's response was characteristic. He laughed. "The Americans," Göring declared, "are building wooden mock-ups to frighten us. These production figures are obvious propaganda." But frontline reports from North Africa told a different story. German forces engaging American units encountered Sherman tanks in quantities that suggested unlimited reserves. When a German panzer commander destroyed 2 American tanks, 4 more appeared. German forces learned to count the destroyed American vehicles as indicators not of victory but of impossible industrial capacity. Each wreck was proof that somewhere across the Atlantic, factories were producing replacements faster than German forces could destroy them. General der Panzertruppe Heinz Guderian, one of Germany's most capable military minds and a man notably more pragmatic than many Nazi leaders, reviewed intelligence on American tank production with growing alarm. Guderian understood logistics. He understood industrial capacity. He understood that modern warfare was ultimately determined by production rates multiplied by time, and the multiplication facing Germany was catastrophic. In his discussions with Albert Speer throughout 1943 and 1944, Guderian repeatedly emphasized that German tank quality was being overwhelmed by American quantity. 1 Tiger tank was worth 5 Shermans in combat, but America was producing 20 Shermans for every Tiger, and German industry lacked the capacity to change that ratio. The production methods Germany couldn't match were being perfected in Detroit throughout 1943. Chrysler engineers continuously optimized the assembly process. Tasks were timed, bottlenecks were identified and eliminated, workstations were reorganized, tool designs were improved, worker training was refined. The result was continuous improvement. The Sherman that took 80 hours to assemble in June 1942 took 60 hours by December 1942 and 50 hours by June 1943. The same workers, the same facilities, but relentless focus on efficiency. This American approach to manufacturing represented a fundamental philosophical difference from German methods. German factories emphasized craftsmanship. Each tank was individually assembled by teams of skilled workers who took pride in precision and quality. The result was superbly engineered. Vehicles that were expensive, time-consuming to produce, and difficult to maintain in field conditions. American factories emphasized standardization. Each tank was assembled from interchangeable parts by workers performing repetitive specialized tasks. The result was adequate vehicles produced in overwhelming numbers with simplified maintenance in field conditions. The German approach valued quality. The American approach valued quantity. In peacetime, the German approach produced better individual products. In total war, the American approach produced victory. By mid-1943, this reality was becoming unavoidable even to the most optimistic German planners. The intelligence reports reaching Berlin in spring 1943 painted an increasingly grim picture. Swedish engineer Erik Lundberg, who had toured Detroit Arsenal in March 1943 as part of a neutral business delegation, provided detailed observations that German intelligence obtained through Stockholm. His report was clinical, technical, and devastating. The plant operates 24 hours daily in two 12-hour shifts, Lundberg wrote. Assembly line velocity is precisely calculated. Each station completes its assigned tasks in exactly the time required for the conveyor to move the chassis to the next position. I observed 17 tanks in various stages of completion, moving simultaneously through the line. Every 48 minutes, a completed tank rolled off the final station. Lundberg's report included photographs. German photo analysts spent weeks examining these images, searching for evidence of deception. They found none. The tanks were real. The assembly line was genuine. The workers visible in the photographs were performing actual assembly tasks, not posing for propaganda. The parking lots adjacent to the factory contained approximately 4,000 automobiles, indicating two-shift operation with a massive workforce. The rail sidings showed dozens of cars, freight cars delivering raw materials. Everything in the photographs confirmed the production claims. When these photographs reached Hermann Göring, he examined them with a magnifying glass, then declared them clever American photographic manipulation, probably using scale models. The analysis supporting this conclusion was non-existent. Göring simply could not accept that democracy, racial mixing, and capitalist individualism could outproduce National Socialist discipline and Aryan racial superiority. To accept the evidence was to accept that the fundamental assumptions of Nazi ideology were false. But Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister and the only member of Nazi leadership with a genuine understanding of industrial production, privately acknowledged the truth. His diary entry for May 15, 1943, discovered after the war, revealed his despair. If the Detroit production figures are even half accurate, we face not defeat but annihilation. They produce more tanks in a month than we do in a year. But I cannot speak this truth. To do so would be my death warrant. Speer's position was impossible. He was responsible for increasing German war production while knowing that even maximum German effort could never match American capacity. He had successfully increased German tank production from 227 tanks in February 1942 to 1,298 tanks in December 1943, a nearly six-fold increase that Hitler celebrated as proof of German industrial superiority. But Speer knew that Detroit Arsenal alone, one single factory operated by one American corporation, was matching his entire national output, and America had dozens of such facilities. The mathematics of industrial warfare were unforgiving. By mid-1943, American tank production reached approximately 2,000 units monthly across all manufacturers and all models. German production reached approximately 1,000 units monthly. The 2-to-1 ratio meant that even if German tanks achieved a 2-to-1 kill ratio in combat, which was optimistic, the numerical balance would remain constant. Any kill ratio, less than 2-to-1, meant gradual American numerical superiority, and the actual battlefield exchange rates in North Africa and later Italy rarely approached 1-to-1, let alone 2-to-1. General der Panzertruppe Hermann Black, one of Germany's most experienced armor commanders, privately noted in June 1943 that American armor tactics compensated for individual tank inferiority through overwhelming numbers. "They attack with 20 tanks where we defend with 4, Black observed. We destroy 10 of theirs. They celebrate having destroyed all 4 of ours. Who has won this exchange? They have 16 tanks remaining. We have none. Mathematically, they have achieved victory through acceptable losses. The disconnect between battlefield reports and Nazi leadership's willingness to believe them widened throughout 1943. Field commanders sent increasingly desperate reports describing American material superiority. These reports were filtered through multiple command layers, each layer softening the assessment to avoid accusations of defeatism. By the time information reached Hitler, the reports described significant American production rather than overwhelming American superiority. The gap between reality and leadership understanding grew with each filtered report. Intelligence from the Pacific Theater provided additional confirmation of American production capacity. Japanese military officials, sharing information with their German allies, reported observations that should have been impossible. American forces in the Pacific were receiving Sherman tanks despite the European theater being the priority. This meant American production was sufficient to supply 2 major theaters simultaneously with surplus capacity. German forces in Russia struggled with tank shortages while fighting on a single front. The implications were obvious but unacceptable. By July 1943, Detroit Arsenal had produced over 10,000 tanks since beginning operations. The cumulative total exceeded Germany's tank production for the entire year of 1942, and Detroit Arsenal was continuously improving efficiency. The December 1942 record of 907 tanks monthly would be matched and exceeded multiple times throughout 1943. The factory workers, many of them women and minorities that Nazi ideology declared inferior, were achieving production rates that German master race workers, with supposedly superior discipline and organization, could not approach. The workforce composition itself challenged every Nazi assumption. Rose Will Monroe, who would become the real-life inspiration for Rosie the Riveter, operated a rivet gun on the B-24 Liberator, assembly line at Willow Run. She had never worked in industry before Pearl Harbor. "We knew we were building something important," Monroe recalled decades later. "Every rivet we drove was going to help end the war. We worked double shifts sometimes, sleeping in the parking lot between shifts. We had brothers, husbands, sweethearts flying these planes. You don't let them down." This motivation, this personal investment in victory by workers who chose to be there rather than being conscripted, produced an intensity of effort that German forced labor could never match. At Detroit Arsenal, similar stories multiplied. Mary Parker, an African-American woman from Alabama who had moved north seeking war work, operated a turret lathe producing transmission components. "They trained me for 3 weeks, Parker remembered. 3 weeks, and then they put me on the line. I was scared I'd make a mistake, mess up somebody's tank. But the foreman said, 'You do your job right. You do it the same, every time, and these boys over in Europe are going to come home.' So that's what I did. Same job, 8 hours a day, 6 days a week. I got good at it." Parker's production output matched or exceeded that of the experienced German machinists whose 5-year apprenticeship supposedly made them superior craftsmen. The German Military Intelligence Service, the Abwehr, was dissolved in February 1944 and absorbed into the SS. This reorganization eliminated the last independent source of realistic intelligence assessment. SS intelligence chief Walter Schellenberg, a loyal Nazi who understood that reporting uncomfortable truths was dangerous, carefully filtered all information about American production to make it more acceptable to Hitler. Reports were modified, production figures were reduced, assessments were softened. The gap between reality and leadership understanding became unbridgeable. But reality doesn't care about ideology. In June 1944, the Allied invasion of Normandy demonstrated American production capacity in a way that no intelligence report could capture. Operation Overlord employed 50,000 vehicles of all types, over 5,000 ships, more than 11,000 aircraft. The sheer material abundance visible on the beaches overwhelmed even the most optimistic German assessment of American capacity. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied Expeditionary Forces, toured the Normandy beaches shortly after D-Day. The landscape was littered with broken, bullet-pierced vehicles, destroyed tanks, burned-out trucks, wrecked landing craft. To the casual observer, it looked like catastrophic loss. To Eisenhower, it represented industrial victory. There was no sight in the war that so impressed me with the industrial might of America as the wreckage on the landing beaches, he later wrote in his memoirs. Each destroyed vehicle would be replaced. American factories were producing tanks, trucks, and landing craft, faster than German forces could destroy them. The wreckage wasn't evidence of failure. It was proof of inevitable victory through industrial superiority. German commanders defending Normandy sent increasingly desperate reports to Berlin, not just about Allied tactical superiority or air dominance, but about material abundance that defied comprehension. American supply depots captured during limited German counterattacks contained more food, fuel, and ammunition than entire German divisions possessed. A single American supply dump held rations sufficient to feed a German army corps for a week. The fuel storage facilities attached to American forward positions exceeded total German fuel reserves in France. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commander of German forces in France, wrote to his wife in June 1944, "The enemy's air superiority is absolute. Their artillery is overwhelming. But it is their endless supplies that truly frighten me. We destroy 10 of their tanks and 20 more appear. We capture their supply dumps and find abundance we cannot imagine. They fight not with courage alone, but with resources we cannot match." This letter, intercepted by Allied intelligence, revealed that even Germany's most capable field marshal understood the fundamental imbalance. The 72-hour production comparison that would later haunt German military analysis emerged from cumulative intelligence gathered throughout 1944. German analysts, compiling data from multiple sources, calculated that Detroit Arsenal at peak production could manufacture approximately 90 Sherman tanks in 72 hours, 3 days. Germany's entire tank production, across all factories, all models, averaged approximately 75 tanks per month in the latter half of 1942, though this improved to over 1,000 monthly by late 1943. Still, the comparison was devastating. One American factory, in 3 days, could produce what took Germany's entire industrial complex a month or more to manufacture during the early war period. This mathematical reality forced German generals to confront an uncomfortable truth. They had superior tactics, better trained soldiers, more experienced commanders, better individual weapons systems, and none of it mattered because they were being buried under an avalanche of American industrial production. Heinz Guderian, meeting with Albert Speer in September 1944, summarized the situation with characteristic bluntness. "We are fighting arithmetic, and arithmetic always wins." The production disparity extended beyond tanks. American factories produced 2.6 million military trucks during the war. Germany produced 345,000. The ratio was 7.5 to 1. This meant American forces possessed mobility that German forces could only dream of. American infantry divisions moved in trucks. German infantry divisions walked. American supply lines stretched hundreds of miles, supported by truck convoys. German supply lines depended on horse-drawn wagons and railways that Allied air power systematically destroyed. The Jeep, that ubiquitous American light vehicle that German soldiers both admired and envied, epitomized American industrial philosophy. Simple design, standardized components, easy to manufacture, easy to maintain, easy to repair. America produced 639,000 Jeeps during the war. Germany produced approximately 20,000 Kübelwagen, their rough equivalent. The 30-to-1 ratio meant that American forces possessed tactical mobility at the squad and platoon level that German forces could achieve only at battalion level. By autumn 1944, even the most fanatical Nazi officials could no longer ignore American production superiority. Joseph Goebbels, Reich Minister of Propaganda, privately noted in his diary, "The Americans are producing weapons in quantities that exceed our most pessimistic estimates. Our soldiers report that destroying American equipment is pointless because replacements arrive immediately. We have created myths about American weakness and inferiority. The Americans have created factories. We are losing this argument. Detroit Arsenal's contribution to Allied victory extended beyond simple numbers. The tanks produced in Warren, Michigan, fought in every theater: North Africa, Sicily, Italy, France, Germany, the Pacific Islands, Philippines, Okinawa. Sherman tanks bearing Detroit Arsenal serial numbers participated in virtually every major engagement from 1943 onward. Some were destroyed in combat. Others survived the entire war. All of them represented industrial capacity that Germany could neither match nor counter. The production record set in December of 1942, 907 tanks in a single month, stood as Detroit Arsenal's peak achievement during the war. Other months approached but never exceeded this figure. Yet even this record understates the facility's importance. The 907 tanks produced in December 1942 represented just 1 month's output from one factory. Sustained over a year, this rate would produce approximately 11,000 tanks annually from Detroit Arsenal alone. Germany's total production for 1942 was approximately 4,300 tanks. The single factory versus entire nation comparison revealed the fundamental industrial imbalance that doomed German war aims. The mathematical inevitability of German defeat through production inferiority was obvious to any analyst willing to examine the figures objectively. But objective analysis required accepting that Nazi ideology was wrong, that racial superiority was a myth, that democracy could outproduce dictatorship, that diverse workforces were more efficient than racially pure ones, that capitalist competition generated better results than state-directed planning. Each of these conclusions contradicted fundamental Nazi beliefs. Therefore, the conclusions had to be wrong. The ideology demanded it. This ideological blindness cost Germany the war as surely as any battlefield defeat. German intelligence collected accurate information about American production. German field commanders reported accurate assessments of American material superiority. German economic analysts calculated accurate predictions of the production imbalance's strategic consequences. All of this information reached Nazi leadership, and all of it was rejected because accepting the truth required abandoning the ideology that justified the regime's existence. General Alfred Jodl, Chief of Operations Staff of the Wehrmacht, testified at Nuremberg after the war. We knew about American production capacity. The intelligence was clear. But to act on this intelligence, to adjust our strategy accordingly, required admitting that we had started a war we could not win. No one would make that admission. So we continued fighting, knowing the outcome was predetermined by industrial arithmetic. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, Chief of the Wehrmacht High Command, echoed this assessment. The reports from Detroit, from all of American industry, were accurate. We knew this by 1943. But what were we to do with this knowledge? Surrender? Accept defeat? Admit that our enemies were stronger? The entire ideology, the entire justification for the war, depended on German superiority. The intelligence contradicted this belief, so we ignored intelligence. The workers at Detroit Arsenal never knew that German generals were calculating production rates and despairing at the numbers. Mary Parker continued operating her lathe. Rose Will Monroe continued driving rivets at Willow Run. Thousands of other men and women continued their repetitive tasks, building weapons that would determine the war's outcome. They worked not because they were forced to, not because ideology demanded it, but because they chose to contribute to victory. This voluntary dedication, multiplied by millions of workers across hundreds of factories, generated industrial output that totalitarian mobilization could not match. By December 1944, 2 years after the record-setting month of 907 tanks, Detroit Arsenal had produced over 22,000 tanks total. This cumulative output exceeded Germany's tank production for the entire year of 1943. One factory. One American corporation, outproducing a nation that had mobilized its entire economy for total war. The comparison wasn't propaganda. It was mathematics. The final accounting, compiled after the war, revealed the full scope of American industrial superiority. Total American tank production from 1940 to 1945, 88,568 tanks and self-propelled guns. Total German tank production from 1939 to 1945, approximately 67,000 tanks and self-propelled guns. Despite 6 years of production, despite total mobilization, despite ruthless efficiency and forced labor, Germany could not match American output achieved in just 4 years, while simultaneously producing aircraft, ships, trucks, and weapons in equally overwhelming quantities. Detroit Arsenal alone produced approximately 25% of all American tanks during World War II. One factory, 22,234 tanks, more than the entire tank production of either Great Britain or Germany individually. This wasn't simply efficient manufacturing. This was industrial capacity on a scale that redefined modern warfare. The 72-hour comparison that haunted German military analysis represented more than production statistics. It represented the collision between ideology and reality. Nazi racial theory claimed that democracy was weak, that racial mixing produced chaos, that Jewish influence corrupted industry, that women were unfit for technical work. Every one of these beliefs was disproven by Detroit Arsenal's assembly line, where diverse workers operating in a democratic society with significant Jewish business leadership and extensive female workforce produced weapons at rates that superior German organization could not approach. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, one of Germany's most senior commanders, acknowledged this reality in post-war interrogation. We were defeated not by American soldiers, though they fought well, but by American factories. Every tank we destroyed was replaced by 2 more. Every aircraft we shot down was replaced by 5 more. We could not win a war of production against an enemy whose single factories outproduced our entire nation. Heinz Guderian, in his post-war memoir Panzer Leader, carefully avoided direct acknowledgement of production inferiority, maintaining the fiction that German defeat resulted from Hitler's strategic errors rather than industrial inadequacy. But in private conversations recorded by Allied intelligence while Guderian was in captivity, he was more candid. Detroit alone had more production capacity than all of Germany. This was known by 1943. But we continued fighting because admitting this truth was unacceptable. The lesson extended beyond World War II. The principle that industrial capacity determines modern war outcomes remained valid throughout the Cold War and into the 21st century. The nation that can produce more tanks, more aircraft, more ships, more missiles, and do so faster and in greater quantities than its adversaries, possesses a fundamental strategic advantage that tactical brilliance cannot overcome. Detroit Arsenal proved this principle in the most direct way possible, by producing weapons faster than the enemy could destroy them. When the war ended in August 1945, Detroit Arsenal suspended tank production immediately. The government cancelled contracts, workers were laid off, the facility transitioned toward peacetime production. The rapid demobilization demonstrated another American advantage. The industrial capacity created for war could return to peacetime manufacturing without economic collapse. German industry, devastated by bombing and dependent on forced labor, could not have achieved similar transition even if given the opportunity. The Detroit Arsenal facility continued producing tanks for subsequent conflicts: Korean War M47 Patterns, Vietnam-era M60S, Desert Storm M1 Abrams tanks. By the time tank production finally ceased in 1996, the facility had produced over 60,000 tanks across 5 decades. The original 1941 decision by Chrysler to accept a contract for weapons they had never built had created an institution that defined American armored warfare for half a century. But the facility's greatest impact remained those 907 tanks produced in December 1942. That single month's production, achieved by workers who had never seen a tank before Pearl Harbor, proved that American democracy could outproduce totalitarian dictatorship, that racial diversity strengthened rather than weakened industrial output, that women could perform technical work as well as men, that voluntary dedication exceeded forced labor, that capitalism generated better results than state planning. German generals admitted, privately if not publicly, that Detroit outproduced them. The admission came in post-war interrogations, in captured documents, in intelligence reports that filtered through neutral countries during the war. The mathematics were undeniable. The implications were catastrophic for Nazi ideology, and the lesson remained relevant decades after the last Sherman tank rolled off Detroit Arsenal's assembly line. In 72 hours, 3 days, Detroit Arsenal could produce approximately 90 tanks at peak efficiency. Germany needed weeks or months to match that output with their entire industrial complex. This wasn't propaganda. This wasn't an exaggeration. This was mathematics. And mathematics, as Heinz Guderian observed, always wins. The story of Detroit Arsenal is ultimately a story about the power of free people working toward a common goal. No forced labor, no racial ideology, no totalitarian control. Just thousands of Americans who chose to build weapons, chose to work double shifts, chose to master repetitive tasks because they believed in the cause and wanted to contribute to victory. That voluntary dedication, multiplied across millions of workers in thousands of factories, generated the arsenal of democracy that buried the Third Reich under an avalanche of industrial production when Rose Will Monroe, the real Rosie the Riveter, met former Luftwaffe pilot Hans Ulrich Rudel at a 1985 ceremony. Rudel asked her, "How did you build so many, so fast?" Monroe's response captured the essence of democratic industrial power. "Honey, we just went to work every day and did our job. Nothing fancy. Just punch in, build bombers, punch out. Democracy isn't complicated. It's just free people doing their best." That simplicity defeated complexity. That freedom defeated control. That diversity defeated racial purity. And Detroit Arsenal's production line, churning out Sherman tanks at rates German generals could barely comprehend, proved that the outcome of industrial warfare is determined not by ideology, but by mathematics. The Germans could not accept this truth until it was too late. By the time German generals admitted that Detroit outproduced them, the war was already lost and the Third Reich was counting its final days. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The intelligence war over American production capacity had begun long before Pearl Harbor. Throughout 1939 and 1940, as Germany conquered Poland and France, German military attachés in Washington observed American industrial capacity with growing concern. Major General Friedrich von Boetticher, the most senior German military observer in the United States, filed regular reports describing what he witnessed. His March 1940 assessment was prophetic. The American automobile industry represents production capacity exceeding all European manufacturing combined. Ford's River Rouge complex alone employs more workers than Germany's 3 largest tank factories. Should America enter the war and convert this capacity to military production, the numerical superiority would be insurmountable within 2 years. Von Boetticher's reports reached the Abwehr, the Wehrmacht High Command, and eventually Hitler's staff. The response was dismissive. Generaloberst Wilhelm Keitel, chief of the Wehrmacht High Command, annotated von Boetticher's to report with a handwritten note. American industrial capacity is irrelevant. They lack the martial spirit and racial discipline necessary for military production. These factories build consumer goods for a weak democratic society. They cannot build weapons for serious warfare. This assessment, written in March 1940, would prove to be one of the most catastrophic intelligence failures in military history. The transformation von Boetticher predicted began even before America entered the war. President Franklin Roosevelt's December 1940 Arsenal of Democracy speech announced American intention to supply Allied forces with weapons, aircraft, and vehicles. German intelligence monitored this speech carefully. The analysis concluded that Roosevelt's promises were political rhetoric designed to reassure the British, not realistic industrial planning. When William Knudsen left his position as president of General Motors to coordinate American war production for a salary of $1 annually, German analysts interpreted this as a publicity stunt rather than serious mobilization. The arsenal of democracy concept represented a fundamental difference in how democratic and totalitarian societies mobilize for war. Germany had spent 6 years preparing, building factories, training workers, stockpiling materials. The Nazi leadership assumed this preparation provided insurmountable advantage over America, which had negligible military production in 1940. What they failed to understand was that America didn't need to build military production capacity from nothing. They needed to convert existing capacity. Detroit already had the factories, the workers, the supply chains, the transportation infrastructure, and most importantly, the organizational expertise to manufacture complex machines in enormous quantities. When K.T. Keller, Chrysler's president, received William Knudsen's call in April 1940 asking if Chrysler could build tanks, Keller's response, "What's a tank look like?" wasn't ignorance, it was confidence. Chrysler had never built tanks, but they understood mass production, they understood assembly lines, they understood how to take a complex machine and break its construction into hundreds of simple, repeatable tasks. Whether the final product was an automobile or a tank was merely a matter of applying their expertise to different specifications. The speed of conversion shocked German observers. Chrysler broke ground on Detroit Arsenal in October 1940. The first M3 tank rolled off the assembly line in April 1941, just 6 months later. In Germany, building a new tank factory required 2 to 3 years from planning to production. Chrysler accomplished it in 6 months, and production began before the building was even complete. German intelligence officers receiving reports of this timeline assumed the information was inaccurate. No factory could be built that quickly. The reports had to be exaggerated, or the tanks were non-functional prototypes, but the tanks were real, and they were functional. More importantly, they were the beginning of a production acceleration that would exponentially increase throughout 1942 and 1943. The first M3 in April 1941 was followed by a second in May. Then 5 in June. Then 20 in July. By December 1941, Detroit Arsenal produced 147 M3 tanks. The exponential growth curve was just beginning. German intelligence tracked these numbers through multiple sources. Neutral Swedish businessmen visiting Detroit, Swiss banking contacts analyzing American industrial investment, Spanish diplomats forwarding American newspaper articles that brazenly published production statistics. Every source confirmed the trend. American tank production was accelerating faster than German analysts had believed possible. Major Reinhard Gehlen, who would later head German military intelligence on the Eastern Front, reviewed these reports in early 1942 and concluded, "If current American production growth continues, they will achieve in 18 months what required Germany 6 years to build. This timeline assumes their growth slows. All evidence suggests it will accelerate." The acceleration Gehlen predicted occurred exactly as he foresaw, but his warnings were ignored. By July 1942, when Detroit Arsenal switched from M3 to M4 Sherman production, the facility was producing over 400 tanks monthly. This represented more tanks in 1 month than Germany had produced in any quarter during 1940. The comparison was available to any German analyst willing to examine the data objectively. The conclusion was unavoidable. America was outproducing Germany despite entering the war 18 months later. The Sherman tank itself embodied American industrial philosophy in ways that German engineers found difficult to accept. When German technical intelligence examined captured Shermans, their assessments were contemptuous. The armor was inferior to German tanks, the gun was less powerful, the design was simple rather than sophisticated. But these flaws were actually deliberate choices, optimizing for mass production rather than individual vehicle superiority. The Sherman was designed to be built quickly, maintained easily, and operated by crews with minimal training. These priorities, speed, simplicity, reliability, were antithetical to German design philosophy, which prioritized performance, complexity, and sophistication. The Sherman's engine configuration illustrated this fundamental difference. The Chrysler-operated 57 multibank, created by welding 5 automobile engines together, struck German engineers as absurd. A proper tank engine should be purpose-built, optimized for power, efficiency, and durability. Connecting 5 car engines was makeshift, crude, inelegant. But crude solutions produced at scale defeat elegant solutions produced in limited quantities. Chrysler already manufactured these automobile engines in huge numbers for civilian production. Converting this existing capacity to tank engines required minimal new tooling. The Germans would have spent 18 months designing and tooling a new purpose-built engine. Chrysler spent 3 months adapting existing engines. The German approach would have produced a better engine. The American approach produced tanks faster. This philosophical divide extended to every aspect of production. German factories employed skilled craftsmen who assembled tanks in teams, with each team responsible for major sub-assemblies. This method produced high-quality vehicles, but required extensive worker training and limited production scalability. American factories employed specialized workers who performed single, repetitive tasks, with the tank moving past stationary workers on an assembly line. This method required minimal worker training and enabled rapid production scaling. A German tank worker needed 2 years of training. An American tank worker needed 3 weeks. The implications for wartime production were staggering. Germany entered the war with approximately 200,000 skilled metal workers trained in military production. This workforce was essentially fixed. Training replacements required years. America entered the war with millions of potential factory workers who could be trained in weeks. When German tank workers were drafted into the Wehrmacht to replace combat casualties, production declined because skilled replacements were unavailable. When American factory workers enlisted in the military, production continued because replacement workers could be trained rapidly from the vast pool of previously unemployed or underemployed civilians. The role of women in American war production represented another fundamental advantage that German ideology prevented them from exploiting. By mid-1943, women comprised approximately 40% of the workforce at Detroit Arsenal. These weren't women performing auxiliary tasks or light assembly work. They operated lathes, welded armor plates, installed engines, and performed every task that male workers performed. The only distinction was that women on average had smaller hands, making them actually superior for detailed work in confined spaces like turret interiors. German ideology declared that women belonged in the home, raising children and supporting their husbands. The Nazi slogan, Kinder, Küche, Kirche, children, kitchen, church, defined women's proper role. While Germany did eventually employ women in factories as manpower shortages became critical, they never achieved the integration or scale of American female industrial employment. This ideological limitation cost Germany millions of potential workers who could have increased production. American factories employed these workers freely, gaining massive production advantage. The African-American workforce at Detroit Arsenal represented another advantage. Nazi ideology prevented Germany from exploiting. Approximately 9% of Detroit Arsenal workers were black, performing skilled technical tasks that Nazi racial theory claimed they were incapable of mastering. Mary Parker, the Alabama woman operating a turret lathe, wasn't an exception. She was one of hundreds of black workers performing skilled manufacturing tasks. Their presence wasn't charity or social policy. It was a cold industrial calculation. America needed maximum production and couldn't afford to exclude capable workers based on race. Germany's forced labor system, by contrast, was both morally abhorrent and economically inefficient. By 1943, German factories employed millions of forced laborers from occupied territories. These workers were poorly fed, brutally treated, and actively hostile to German war aims. They sabotaged production, when possible, worked slowly when sabotage was impossible, and required extensive supervision to prevent both. The advantage of forced labor, no wages paid, was offset by poor productivity, high supervision costs, and constant sabotage. American workers, by contrast, were well paid, well fed, and motivated to maximize production. The economic efficiency of voluntary labor exceeded forced labor, but Nazi ideology prevented German leadership from acknowledging this reality. The December 1942 production record of 907 tanks represented the culmination of 18 months of continuous optimization at Detroit Arsenal. Every aspect of production has been analyzed, refined, and improved. The assembly line layout had been reconfigured 7 times, each reconfiguration reducing the time required for tanks to move from station to station. Worker tasks had been studied using time-motion analysis, with inefficient movements eliminated and tools redesigned for faster operation. Supply logistics had been optimized, so materials arrived at each station exactly when needed, eliminating both shortages and excess inventory. The 907 tanks produced in December 1942 represented an average of 1 tank every 49 minutes, but this average concealed important variation. Early in the month, production rate was approximately 1 tank per hour. By mid-month, increased efficiency reduced this to 1 tank every 52 minutes. During the final week of December, as workers and management pushed to set a record, production accelerated to 1 tank every 43 minutes during peak shifts. This final week acceleration demonstrated that the maximum production rate wasn't actually maximum. With sufficient motivation, the line could run even faster. German intelligence receiving reports of the December 1942 record faced impossible choices. Report the numbers accurately and be accused of defeatism. Reduce the numbers to make them acceptable and provide inaccurate intelligence. Most chose the latter. Reports forwarded to the Wehrmacht High Command described Detroit Arsenal's December production as approximately 300 tanks, with higher figures being propaganda exaggeration. This 3-to-1 reduction made the numbers acceptable to Nazi leadership, but rendered the intelligence worthless for strategic planning. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commanding German forces in North Africa, received intelligence about American tank production throughout 1942 and 1943. His response, documented in letters to his wife and in official reports, evolved from skepticism to alarm to despair. In March 1942, Rommel wrote, "Intelligence reports claim Americans are producing 500 tanks monthly. This seems excessive, but even half that number would be concerning. By September 1942, American tanks appear in every engagement. We destroy them, and more arrive. Either production is far higher than estimated, or they are stripping their forces elsewhere, which seems unlikely." By March 1943, the American tanks are endless. Intelligence now estimates 2,000 monthly production. This must be accurate because we face this number in the field. How do we fight an enemy with such capacity? Rommel's field experience confirmed what intelligence reported, but leadership denied. American production was overwhelming German capacity. The North African campaign became a test case, demonstrating that tactical brilliance couldn't overcome material inferiority. Rommel won battles repeatedly, destroyed Allied tanks in numbers exceeding his own losses, and still gradually lost ground because destroyed American tanks were replaced faster than destroyed German tanks. The Battle of El Alamein in October 1942 demonstrated this arithmetic brutally. British forces, equipped with American Sherman tanks, lost hundreds of vehicles, but continued attacking because replacements arrived continuously. German forces, after losing fewer tanks, were forced to retreat because no replacements existed. The intelligence reaching Berlin from North Africa should have prompted strategic reassessment. If one American factory could produce 900 tanks monthly, and Germany faced similar production from multiple American factories plus British and Soviet production, then the Axis was facing combined Allied tank production, possibly exceeding 5,000 units monthly by late 1942. German production was approximately 1,000 monthly. The 5-to-1 ratio meant Germany needed to achieve 5-to-1 kill ratios merely to maintain numerical parity. Actual combat exchange rates rarely exceeded 1-to-1. Albert Speer understood these numbers. His March 1943 memo to Hitler, marked Top Secret, for the Führer's eyes only, laid out the production comparison starkly. American tank production now exceeds German production by approximately 3-1. British and Soviet production combined exceed our production by similar margins. The cumulative Allied advantage is approximately 7-1. Absent dramatic increase in our production, or equally dramatic decrease in Allied production, numerical superiority will decide the war's outcome regardless of tactical considerations. Hitler's response to Speer's memo was characteristic. Production statistics are meaningless. Wars are won by will, by faith, by determination. The German soldier is worth 10 Allied soldiers. Our superior tactics, training, and equipment overcome mere numbers. Production will increase as you implement efficiency improvements. The Allies will collapse when we demonstrate German invincibility in battle. This response dismissed objective analysis in favor of ideological certainty. Mathematics was subordinate to will. Reality was subordinate to belief, but reality doesn't. Negotiate. Throughout 1943, the production gap widened. American factories continuously improved efficiency. Detroit Arsenal's record of 907 tanks in December 1942 was approached multiple times in 1943, with several months exceeding 850 tanks. Other American facilities contributed similarly impressive numbers. Fisher Tank Arsenal in Grand Blanc, Michigan, produced over 1,000 M4A3 Shermans in 1943. Lima Locomotive Works in Ohio produced over 900 M4A1 Shermans. Federal Machine and Welder Company in Warren, Ohio, produced over 600 M4A3 variants. The cumulative American production reached approximately 21,000 tanks in 1943. German production, despite Speer's improvements, reached approximately 12,000. The ratio had actually worsened from 3-1 to nearly 2-1, but this improvement was misleading. German production increase came from running factories at unsustainable rates, consuming stockpiled materials, and stripping other sectors of resources. American production increase came from building new factories and improving efficiency at existing ones. The German increases were temporary. The American increases were permanent and still accelerating. By June 1944, when Allied forces landed at Normandy, the cumulative production gap had become insurmountable. America had produced approximately 65,000 tanks by D-Day. Germany had produced approximately 38,000 in the same period. Even accounting for losses in training, transit, and combat, American numerical superiority was overwhelming. The 5,000 Allied vehicles employed in Operation Overlord represented approximately 2 months of American production. Replacing D-Day losses would require 8 to 10 weeks. Germany couldn't replace equivalent losses in 6 months. The weeks following D-Day provided the Commisside Weltdeist, clearest demonstration of industrial warfare's arithmetic. German forces fought brilliantly, inflicting casualties at rates exceeding their own losses. And they lost ground steadily because material losses couldn't replace determined outcomes regardless of tactical success. General der Panzertruppe, Leoger von Schweppenberg, commanding German armoured forces in Normandy, reported in July 1944, "We destroy 3 Allied tanks for every one we lose. We are losing this battle because they can afford 3-1 losses, and we cannot afford 1-1 losses. This is not warfare. This is mathematics." The 72-hour comparison emerged from German staff analyses, attempting to understand the production gap. Multiple officers performed these calculations independently, reaching similar conclusions. Detroit Arsenal, at peak December 1942, production averaged 29 tanks daily, multiplied by 3 days, 87 tanks, Germany's total production across all facilities in December 1942 was approximately 900 tanks monthly, or 30 tanks daily. One American factory nearly matched Germany's entire national output, and the American factory was still improving efficiency while German production was approaching maximum capacity. These calculations circulated among German general staff officers throughout 1944. They appeared in staff studies, strategic assessments, and planning documents. But they never prompted meaningful strategic change because the arithmetic contradicted fundamental Nazi beliefs about racial superiority and German invincibility. To accept the numbers was to accept defeat. So the numbers were acknowledged but not acted upon. Heinz Guderian, Inspector General of Panzer Troops, presented these calculations to Hitler at a November 1944 strategy conference. Hitler listened impatiently as Guderian explained that Detroit Arsenal alone was producing in 3 days what Germany produced in 1 month during early war years. Hitler's response dismissed the entire analysis. Statistics without context are meaningless. German quality exceeds American quantity. 1 Tiger tank is worth 5 Shermans. 1 German soldier is worth 5 American soldiers. Your calculations ignore qualitative superiority. Guderian attempted to argue that even assuming German qualitative superiority, the quantitative gap was too large. If Germany had a 5-to-1 qualitative advantage but faced a 10-to-1 quantitative disadvantage, the outcome was still a 2-to-1 Allied advantage. Hitler ended the discussion. This conference will address strategy, not defeatist mathematical abstractions. Germany wins through will, not calculation. But battles are fought with weapons, and weapons come from factories. The will Hitler invoked couldn't materialize tanks from thin air. By December 1944, Germany faced critical tank shortages despite maximum production effort. The Battle of the Bulge, Germany's last major offensive, employed approximately 1,000 tanks, impressive concentration achieved by stripping defensive positions elsewhere. The attack surprised Allied forces, achieved initial success, but ultimately failed for one simple reason. German losses couldn't be replaced while American losses could be. American forces lost hundreds of tanks in the Battle of the Bulge. These losses were replaced within weeks by production from Detroit, Arsenal, and other facilities. German forces lost fewer tanks but couldn't replace them. The numerical balance after the battle favored the Allies more than before it, despite Germany winning tactical engagements. This pattern tactical success producing strategic failure defined Germany's final year of war. Detroit Arsenal's production continued through May 1945, ending only when Germany surrendered. The facility's final wartime total, 22,234 tanks, produced in 49 months. This represented 1 tank completed every 99 minutes, averaged across the entire production period. The average concealed significant variation. Early production was slower, peak production much faster, late production slowed by material shortages, but the overall output demonstrated sustained industrial capacity Germany never approached. The post-war analysis, commissioned by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, included extensive interviews with German military and industrial leaders. These interviews revealed that German intelligence had accurately assessed American production capacity by mid-1943, but Nazi leadership refused to adjust strategy based on this intelligence. Albert Speer, interrogated at length about industrial production, stated, "We knew Detroit Arsenal alone was outproducing our entire tank industry." This information was reported to Hitler multiple times. He dismissed it as propaganda. By 1944, even Hitler couldn't deny the numbers, but by then, adjustment was impossible. Heinz Guderian, who spent 3 years in Allied custody after the war, was equally candid in private conversations recorded by intelligence officers. The production figures from Detroit were accurate. Any competent analyst could verify them through multiple sources. We reported these figures accurately to leadership. The response was always the same. The figures were exaggerated, or they represented propaganda, or quality mattered more than quantity. We knew by 1943 that the war was lost through production inferiority. We continued fighting because admitting this was impossible. The admission that Detroit outproduced Germany came grudgingly, piece by piece, in those post-war interrogations and captured documents. German generals admitted it, German intelligence officers admitted it, even some Nazi officials admitted it, though always with qualifications and excuses. The admission validated what American workers at Detroit Arsenal had accomplished. They had built weapons faster than the enemy could destroy them, and in doing so, They had won the production war that determined the shooting war's outcome. The 72-hour comparison, Detroit Arsenal's 3-day production matching Germany's monthly output during early war years, became shorthand for the production gap. It wasn't the most precise comparison. German production improved significantly after 1942, but it captured the essential truth. American industrial capacity, exemplified by Detroit Arsenal, exceeded German capacity by margins that made Axis victory impossible once America entered the war. Rose Will Monroe's observation to the German pilot, "We just went to work every day and did our job," explained how democracy won the production war. No forced labor, no ideological restrictions on who could work, no complex theories about racial superiority, just millions of free people choosing to build weapons because they believed in the cause. That voluntary dedication, multiplied across every factory in America, generated production that totalitarian mobilization couldn't match. The mathematics were undeniable. The implications were catastrophic for German strategy, and the lesson remained relevant for any future conflict. In industrial warfare, the nation that can produce more weapons faster wins, regardless of tactical or strategic brilliance. Detroit Arsenal proved this in the most direct way possible. One Sherman tank at a time, 907 tanks in a single month, thousands of tanks per year, until the arithmetic of production determined the arithmetic of victory. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.